My name is Dr. Samuel Wheeler, and I am research historian here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois.
And I am Dr. James Cornelius, the curator of the Lincoln Collection here at the Presidential Library and Museum. And Sam and I are going to tell you a few of the behind the scenes and unusual and interesting stories about some of the artifacts in our new show, Undying Words. Come with us, please.
So we're here in front of the display for the second inaugural, and I'm struck by that picture.
Yeah, the second inaugural address, March 4th, 1865. We're in the 150th anniversary of that right now. It's a little bit like the Gettysburg Address situation when Lincoln spoke so briefly that the photographers barely had time to get together.
Oh, it takes them a long time to set up, and you know, you've got the whole leg and taking the photograph and people not moving, so it was a challenging shot, I'm sure, for them to take.
But Alexander Gardner was really skilled. He knew what he was doing. He did get, we think, 5 shots, maybe 6 that survived.
Oh,
Lincoln,
really?
Lincoln is not very visible.
It's really hard to make him out, actually, but the thing that I always do to try to find him is to find the table that is on that, what do we call that, a little ledge
they're up there on the platform. That sort of Roman column plinth that's his reading table.
So they're all standing sort of on a staircase, right? That's why it's a sort of a graduated slope. The thing that now is really intriguing to us is if we look on the portico above Lincoln, they say you can see John Wilkes Booth in that picture.
You can see him very clearly in two of the photos. He is in this one, but this is one that shows Lincoln a little better than the others, and Booth is less visible. But there's that big white statue up on the top of the portico, and Booth is right in front of that. He's wearing a tall hat, and then he's moving back toward the building. There's a theory that he actually meant to kill Lincoln inside the Capitol building.
Oh my goodness.
On his way out to or back in from giving his speech. And then what was discovered something like 50 years ago, I mean, they didn't know it for 100 years, in other words, is that down in front of Lincoln on the ground, right under his table, are all the other conspirators. Lewis Payne.
Is Lewis Payne, does he have the sort of cowboy slouch hat?
He's the big guy wearing the big hat. And Surratt and Surratt and Powell.
My goodness.
Sorry, not Powell. Payne, Powell, same guy. Davy Harold are all there. And it's just really eerie. They're looking at the crowd. They're thinking about what they're going to do. And so this is why it's just such a painful moment, because here he's giving this tremendous speech, and we do not own the full draft of the second inaugural address. We own something that is in some respects even more wonderful. Lincoln wrote out a short passage from it twice at the request of 2 different women, interestingly, and this one we call the Amanda Hall letter. She was the sister of a congressman, and the congressman asked her, "Would you do this little favor for my sister?" So Lincoln wrote it out.
What I find so interesting about this letter, it's interesting, he signs A. Lincoln on the letter portion, and then when he copies out that famous passage of the second inaugural, he writes out Abraham Lincoln. It's very interesting.
It's a public address.
There can't be that many letters with A. Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln in the same letter.
Excellent point. Yes, this is worth a lot of money. It's worth a lot of money.
Piece of American history.
Yeah, because it's so unusual. He knew it was a great speech. Let's not fool ourselves. He was a humble man, but he knew when he'd really worked up something great. And he wrote out the Gettysburg Address 5 times in different ways, all for different reasons, every one of them for a different reason. And in the second inaugural address, he writes out the whole thing a couple times. He works on it a while, but then he wrote out a bit more of it at the request of 2 people who admired it immediately. This is obvious that he's proud of it, and the people recognize it right away. But so, what's the most famous part of the second inaugural? How's it end? This is a
malice
quiz.
towards none,
With
right?
malice toward none, with charity for all.
Absolutely.
That's not what he wrote here. What he wrote here is the biblical part, the long view for this woman. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. And then he goes back and quotes one of the Psalms about, written nearly, he redated it actually in his own remarks, 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, whatever. He was pretty close. He was not a biblical scholar. He just knew the words. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. This is how he explained the war.
He answers that question that we're still fighting about today. What caused the war? Lincoln tells us very clearly slavery is at the root of the cause of this war.
Yeah. And our suffering is God's judgment on us for that sin.
Divine retribution.
And so we put this next to something just as a little reminder, another unpleasant fact about that day, 150 years ago, in addition to the murderers all lined up there practically surrounding him, is that he ran with Andrew Johnson, ex-Democrat of Tennessee. Here's a little four-color ribbon. Don't see too many of those. They're mainly black and white. The Lincoln and Johnson Campaign Club from 1864. Andrew Johnson was sitting right there in the front row, drunk, while Lincoln gave his remarks. Johnson was, as they say today, self-medicating. He was victim of a very bad cold. It was a typical spring in Washington, D.C. in early March. He had a really bad cold, so he was trying to perk himself up with some of the strong stuff. And pretty much everyone knew that he was out of control. Really unfortunate. And he proves to be a man not up to the job as president.
Now, campaign memorabilia from the 1864 election, what is more rare, a Lincoln and Johnson campaign piece or a Lincoln and Hamlin piece?
There's definitely much less Lincoln and Johnson, 1864. And that's partly because the movement's not brand new, although the cause is different now. They're the Union Party, not the Republican Party right now. But because Hamlin was widely admired in the Northeast, and a lot of this stuff got produced in the Northeast, and it's a new party, and it's a four-way race in 1860. It's hugely exciting, so there's tons and tons of that stuff. Not to say that it's cheap. The good ones are not cheap.
Sure.
They're beautiful. A lot of them are beautifully made. 1864 is a different thing. The country is torn apart by the war, and some people are not happy with the idea of an ex-Democrat from Tennessee on the ticket with Lincoln. And yet Lincoln viewed this as a national effort. All sections, all parties have to be represented.
It even leads to a transformation of the name.
It does.
They don't run as Republicans, they run as the Union Party.
The Union Party, it's about the Union. Ending slavery is part of the Union. The Union is part of ending slavery. It's one and the same for Lincoln. So Johnson kind of rambles, he stumbles through his speech. He wavers a little on the platform. Secretary of State Seward leans over to Lincoln and says, and let's not let him speak anymore after he's done his remarks.
I was going through Orville Browning's diary yesterday, and he makes reference to watching Johnson's speech. Very critical of him.
Well, we're dwelling on the negative here, but the positive is that this sensational passage from the second inaugural is here preserved in this letter for, in some ways, a typical American woman who did have a little more access to the president because her brother was a Washington official. And yet he's aware that this is a small form of person-to-person, individual campaigning and friendship to give her a letter that quotes this historic speech.
He's proud of those words, and those words really are what this whole exhibit's about.
Yeah, it is.
His undying words.
You compare this very short second inaugural speech It's the second shortest in our history. George Washington, first in many respects, gave the shortest.
Oh, I've never put that together, actually.
Yeah.
Oh,
well,
wow.
Washington, when he was reelected, knew
Yeah.
there's no reason for further remarks like this. We're just, we're going forward. But Lincoln's first inaugural speech, which we have in the original printer's galleys over in the other case there, is kind of fun because the printer was paying attention. Lincoln had it printed by his friend, the printer here in town, the Republican printers at the Daily Journal. And Baker ticks off the 2 paragraphs at the start of it. You can see it in the margin that got cut from the delivered version of the speech. So you can kind of read.
Something to look for.
This is the first draft of it by the time Lincoln got to Washington and showed it to William Seward, the real pro, the veteran of the party. Seward recommended a little bit of this, a little bit of that. You got to come down.
He has some great editorial remarks, and Lincoln, to his wisdom, accepts and tweaks those comments as well.
Yeah, and so you see that in a different form here on the printed galleys.
Oh, that's amazing.
Back in the in Springfield, they're all following along. So yeah, his 2 great inaugural speeches. That one was pretty long, conciliatory. This one was very short and almost apologetic. Humble.
It surprises a lot of people. We just think about the different moods in Washington during the first inaugural and the second inaugural. The first inaugural, everyone is so tense. There's, open secessionist talk on the streets. The second inaugural, people come to Washington, they see the end of the Civil War on the horizon, but Lincoln doesn't give that valedictory sort of a speech. It's sort of a very subdued speech that Fred Douglass calls more of a sermon than a speech. I love that comment about this speech.
That's true. He's kind of our national clergyman at the hour of pain. The Gettysburg Address is the other case where he's basically being the minister. He's saying last rites over those thousands of dead Americans whose graves he can see from the platform at Gettysburg. He's giving this condolence.
It's almost like he found a rhythm. Late in life, sort of that, sort of redefining the way that political speeches were. Both the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural are very brief speeches, but he finds a way to say so much using so few words.
Yeah, and maybe that's why Gardner got ready quickly for the second inaugural.
Would he have been tipped off that this is going to be a short speech, do you think?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
I've never thought about that.
I sort of doubt it. I sort of doubt it because in some ways, yes, you do expect triumphalism a little bit. Congratulations.
Yeah.
You don't get it.
No.
You don't get anything that anybody's expecting. Lincoln was his own man.